I now call Adil Hakim of Raffles Institution.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is quite unfair for the proposition to accuse us of not doing enough for the low-income groups, when we ourselves, as the Ministry of Trade and Industry, are committed to looking at the long-term issues and how to solve them in the long term. This means that financial system schemes and the like are things that will enable us to help them better in the long run, as well as preserving jobs, which should be part of my main substantive for today. And we say that as the proposition, instead of advocating a long-term solution, what they're simply doing is advocating a one-time stopgap solution that throws money at the problem without actually solving it. And so we say, no thank you, madam. We say that ultimately we are the side that does more for the low-income groups for today. But firstly, let me move on to my three main rebuttals for today. Number one, how long are we going to pay for these cash out handouts? Secondly, do people spend these cash handouts? Thirdly, even if they were to spend, what will the benefits be? No thank you, sir. So, firstly, the opening proposition has not given us a single time frame as to when exactly they will end these cash handouts. If we assume that it is a one-time thing, then we say that it will not have enough power to stimulate the economy, because I give you the example of the 1999 Japan coupon program, which spent 700 billion yen, but only increased in domestic spending by 0.1%. We say this is a giant waste of money, and we say that if the other alternative is to give them indefinitely, and they have not given us a time frame to do so, as Nanyang says, it will be simply unsustainable. So, no thank you, sir. Secondly, do people spend? Now, we say that the opening proposition themselves has conceded that because you're talking about the lower to middle class people, these people are not the kind of people who will not easily give up their lifestyles and treat them to luxuries every single day of their lives, even in a recession. These people are pragmatic. You're talking about the lower income groups in society. This means that they always have to ensure that they have enough liquidity to last them throughout the crisis. And we say that, therefore, there is no incentive for them to keep on spending wantonly, and therefore your policy will not work in this case. So, number three, the benefits to the people, do they exist at all? Firstly, we do acknowledge that GST credits have good intentions, but the key here is the long term which we are focusing on, and this means we need to focus on industries and the preservation of jobs. No, thank you, madam. Secondly, we say that we already give enough to the poor anyway because of the financial assistance schemes. And if we're talking about spending here, we see that lower to middle income groups, as you have conceded, spend on essential household items. That means that they will spend on them anyway, and it merely replaces household spending with government spending. This means there's no additional spending and therefore no additional growth to the economy. Ultimately, what we need to... No, thank you, sir. And on the larger scale, we say that since the 40% of these people actually contribute to 75% of government earnings, we say that we should target these people, target the industries that they work in, and therefore stimulate the economy that way, because that is our ultimate yardstick for today. So, as the Ministry of Trade and Industry, what we want ultimately is to aid industries in the strategic direction which we want to go. And cash handouts here are a step in the wrong direction, and therefore should not be done. Because we say that if you are talking about things like disposable cash and therefore spending, ensuring people's jobs is the way to go. So what we're looking here for is what's best for citizen welfare in the short term and in long term, and what stimulates economic growth ultimately. So now on to my substantive for today on the whole idea of, firstly, how we can preserve jobs, and secondly, about industrial development. No, thank you, sir. Now, firstly, we say that the core of our economy lies in businesses. They provide jobs for people, generate trade with other markets, and thus stimulate economic growth. However, the financial crisis hurts the profitability of these businesses, so the government should help them stay competitive. Cash handouts, however, only replace household spending with government spending. Hold on a moment, ma'am. Whereas spending money on businesses helps viable and relevant businesses stay afloat amidst these turbulent times, like petrochemical and the pharmaceutical industries. What do you have to say to that, ma'am?
But don't you think the government is in fact neglecting the people who need it the most, which are the lower income groups? And we say that this is also a form of growth whereby society progresses.
Thank you, ma'am. Now, let me make this very clear. Number one, we are not alienating the low-income groups. I've already told you about the numerous schemes we have in place, and that is part of a separate policy that we do not need to achieve right now. And secondly, let me point you towards the motion. And then the second part says, stimulate the growth in the economy. Now, we do acknowledge the good intentions here, but ultimately, the aim that we are working towards is the long-term well-being of our economy, and nothing about cash handouts screams about the fact that it's only going to be ineffective. So, in fact, domestic spending does little to help because Singaporeans are not the main consumers of their industry's products, and I'll explain why. You see, PM Lee Hsien Loong himself said during the APEC summit in Peru that 60 cents of each dollar spending leaks out because of the purchase of imports. Singapore It's a small economy after all. And while handouts do increase domestic spending, Singapore's industries, for example electronics and port services, are export-oriented, and they depend on bigger markets like the US and Japan. Thus, we recognize that there are better ways to ensure our people's welfare than the temporary measures of cash handouts. As the MTI, we know Singapore's economy is driven by the twin engines of manufacturing and services. And since our market is small, our vision should encompass a globalized and diversified economy. So because stimulating domestic spending does nothing to help this is why we should focus on industries. We aim for job retention, which serves citizens' financial security better, and to do so, we must ensure that businesses survive. Our second aim is to promote entrepreneurship through helping companies with startup funds. And lastly, we want to work with industry promotion agencies to further develop the industries for long-term growth. So I beg you, ladies and gentlemen, please go with the opposition.
Thank you, Adil. The speaker spoke for 5 minutes and 40 seconds. I now call Emrys Lee of Methodist Girls' School to conclude the case and summarize for the proposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's not forget today that part of the budget and part of this policy is not only to bring about economic growth in the country, it's also about the government catering to the people and meeting the needs of the people, especially the lower income groups who are hit the worst in times of recession. Now, I'll be going on to cover this in my two main points of contention today. The first on what best benefits the people, and the second of which policy best benefits the economy. Now, onto my first point of contention today. Now, on what benefits the people. The opposition has come up here today with a whole policy on GST cuts, and I'll explain to you later why this only and mostly benefits the rich, whereas we have our policy is directed at not only everyone, but is especially focused at the lower income groups, who are the people who need it the most and who will use this the best. Now we see that the lower income groups are hit the worst by the recessions because they're the ones who can't afford to cut down on their lifestyle, because they can't afford to cut down on the basic necessities, they can't afford to cut down on education. And when they do, when they're forced to because they're not given these cash handouts, what is going to happen is that we'll have people in the country who are suffering because they can't afford education, because they can't afford the basic necessities. Now firstly, we see on a principle level that it is wrong for the government to allow such big groups to suffer in this way. And secondly, we see that this is going to create a long-term detriment in the future when you have a generation of people and some people who are uneducated and unable to cope with the economy. Now we see that what happens in GST cuts is that the people who spend are the ones who save the money. Now, ladies and gentlemen, logic shows that the people who spend the most are the rich. And so what we see is that on their side of the house, the policy that they've proposed caters the most to the rich and helps the rich save the most, where it is the poor who need it the most. No, thank you, sir. Secondly, we see that it is the government's duty to support the less advantaged. For example, like the government has measures such as ramps for the handicapped, because they recognize that when people are in need, there's even more of a role, more of a responsibility on the government to help these people. And we see that when the people see that the government is doing something to help them, it will create a symbiotic relationship between the government and the people, which brings about a culture of trust. Secondly, what we see is that this policy brings about other benefits as well. For example, the Op2 came up here today with the whole idea that of helping people by keeping the jobs. But we see that if you don't give them the cash handouts, it's going to mean nothing if they keep their jobs, because we see that it's not going to happen. Because without the demand, companies have no incentive to keep these workers, and it's going to be completely self-defeating. Secondly, we see that these people keeping their jobs is not going to work in the long run if they can't even afford their basic sustenance. And we see that they've also come up here today with the idea of startup funds for MNCs and for entrepreneurs. But we see that people are not going to take these up, because the very existence of such things shows that people are unwilling and reluctant to go into these sort of entrepreneurships and businesses because of the risk involved. Secondly, we said that a majority of the economy is still boosted by the spending of the people, and that this is what we should concentrate on today, the demand. Now let me go on to my second point of contention on which policy best benefits the economy. The long-term solution that the opposition has brought up today, or the proposition solution of cash handouts, which helps both the short term and the long term. Now we see that their policy doesn't even help the people in the long term, because when you cut the GST, what you're cutting is the amount of money that the government can receive to reinvest in the economy so as to stimulate growth. And we see that this affects other measures as well, such as their whole idea of meritocracy and retraining, that we're going to have less money to do this once you cut the GST. Secondly, we see that there's an urgent, immediate need to help the people, because we see that people predict that the economy is going to contract by 5% in 2009, and that we simply cannot afford for these people to suffer. Now we see that our policy helps people in the short term, because we see that the poorest people spend on necessities, they spend on education, especially, and they're the ones who benefit the most from this policy because of the progressive cash handouts. And we see that furthermore, they spend immediately, because once they get the money, they immediately go down to get the basic necessities that they need. And so what we see is that they spend in these local economies in small things, and what you have is a multiplying effect, where the money that is sent into these local companies is then used to buy, for example, resources. And we see what happens is that the effects we see are huger than anything we see from corporations. Secondly, we see that even if people do save, what it does is that this money helps the banks, and it gives money to the banks. So what happens is that they have money to invest, and they have money to loan out, and this in fact helps the businesses as well. Now we see that this policy also helps people in the long term, because it increases the local demand. And what happens when this happens is that people from foreign companies and local companies will be more willing to invest, and this will stimulate the economy. And we see lastly that for companies to profit, we first need for there to be a high demand. And so with this, go with the side of the house that brings about the best short-term and long-term solution.
Thank you, Amaris. The speaker spoke for 5 minutes and 14 seconds. I now call Nicholas Kwa of Raffles Institution to conclude the case and summarize for the opposition.
So let me unpack their logic for them. They tell us they want to create domestic spending to such an extent that it can replace exports as a way of stabilizing our economy. And the way they would do so is by things like GST rebates and liquid assets, as our opening house told us. Now the problem with this is simple. For them to tell us that they want to aid the lower income groups with these liquid assets, but at the same time tell us that the largest contributors to our GDP through the GST is the higher income group, is a fundamental contradiction. Problematic, ladies and gentlemen. They told us that they want to stimulate economic growth through allowing the people to spend more. But their policy targets the people who, by their own concession, spend the least. Doesn't fit, right? So let me tell you why it doesn't fit. First of all, if the people should spend. Now, they've given us a few reasons for why people would spend the money that they give them. First of all, by lifestyle. And we've told you very simple things. First, they haven't told us why the current financial assistance schemes of helping people who are not able to cope with basic necessities are insufficient, and therefore they have not given us a justification for this extraneous policy. Now then, we've also told you that if these lifestyles are unsustainable and should be cut because of the current economic climate, then so be it, let them be cut. And their answer to this was that the things that people are cutting down on are things that shouldn't be cut down on, like basic necessities and like education. Now, for basic necessities, the problem with this is simple. Whether or not you give them cash handouts, people will have to spend on basic necessities. So when you do give them cash handouts, what happens then is a replacement effect. People will spend the money you give them on basic necessities, and they'll save the rest of the money. What happens is these people have more to save, because as they've already told us, these people don't have very much money to begin with. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, the economy will not grow, nor will it, as they hope, stabilize, because you are merely replacing money that would have otherwise been spent. Now, for education, we've already told all of you that we would be investing in various infrastructure that will help Singapore's economy come out of this recession better, one of which is education. Now, I must admit, I'm not too clear about what our government's policy on education is, but I do believe that we place a very strong importance on education for our people. With this, we believe that if that's the case, and if people are compromising on education, then we will probably give them targeted assistance, but not a generic cash handout. Because, ladies and gentlemen, a generic cash handout is not going to help as they want them to. Now, for saving, the problem with saving is simple, that it provides only marginal utility. Now, the problem with using the term marginal utility is the same problem with the point itself, that it doesn't apply to the common man. The common man doesn't understand what marginal utility is, nor does he, ladies and gentlemen, understand their problem with saving. The perception is simple. Economic crisis, I might go bankrupt, I might not have enough money to spend tomorrow, therefore I save. They don't know, ladies and gentlemen, what marginal utility is. If I would confess, I myself don't really know what marginal utility is. Ladies and gentlemen, the perception is still there, which is why people will still save, which is why cash handouts wouldn't really stimulate domestic spending. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this leads me very nicely on to my second point of contention, that on domestic spending and its role in Singapore's economy. Now, they've told us at the very beginning that they don't wish to expand the economy, or they don't expect cash handouts to create a sudden expansion in the economy. What they have told us is they expect the economy to stabilize. Now, here is why it will not happen. Because our previous economy relied largely on imports by foreign markets, that is, exports on our side. Now, fundamentally, ladies and gentlemen, our domestic market is much smaller than the market out there. Hold on a moment, sir. Because it is much smaller than the market out there, it is impossible for us to rely solely on the domestic market to replace the foreign market simply because of size and scale. Yes, what you have to say.
It's not just imports, so we see that cash handouts have a multiplier effect because one spending contributes.
Thank you. Yes, sir, sorry. I'm sorry to have waved you down like that, but I was just about to talk about the multiplier effect. Now, having told you why it cannot be stabilized purely by domestic market, let me now tell you what they said about the multiplier effect. Now, they told us that because people buy when there's more liquidity in the market, more money will be spent, and therefore all the industries will benefit. That's the multiplier effect in simple terms. But the problem with this, ladies and gentlemen, is that as my first speaker has told you, with every dollar spent in the Singaporean economy, the likelihood is that 60 cents will leak out. Which means, ladies and gentlemen, that for every transaction, much amount of it is lost, which is why our policy has always been this, to target directly the industries. Now, before I go on into an explanation of my policy, let me tell you about the comparison between GST cuts and GST rebates, as they would have it, if I could classify their policy as a GST rebate. Now, they've told us that the problem with GST cuts is that the people need it now. And our problem with that is simple. If they're going to give off a one-off cash handout, then it isn't really going to save these people because these people are not going to suddenly be able to provide for themselves with this cash handout. Now, then let me move on to my policy. On the Ministry of Trade and Industry, we've always had the bigger picture in mind. We believe in the sustenance of our people and of our industry. But we would place emphasis on the industry for the simple reason that through job retention, our people will benefit anyway. Ladies and gentlemen, we have the bigger picture. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. The speaker spoke for 5 minutes and 39 seconds. Thank you, judges and debaters. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the secondary division of the MOF Inter-School Budget Debate Finals. I now hand you back to your MC, Sarah Ann.
Thank you, Christy. And thank you, debaters. It was truly engaging. And thank you all for listening. Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for your schools.